Why is Canada still paying American ports to move Canadian grain? Why are prairie farmers funding U.S. logistics when Europe is closer than Washington wants you to believe? And why did Ottawa quietly decide that American control over Canada's food supply chain had gone too far? This wasn't a debate. It wasn't a policy paper. It was a line being crossed. Over the past year, Canada has begun executing a strategy that fundamentally restructures how its grain and fertilizer reach the world. A strategy that removes the United States from the center of a market worth $780 billion over the next decade. And tonight, we're breaking down how this shift is already underway, and why Washington has no real way to stop it. For generations, Canadian agriculture operated under an unspoken rule: grow in the prairies, ship south, ask permission later. Saskatchewan grows the wheat, Alberta produces the canola. Canada mines more potash than any country on Earth.
They start charging and sending the, very high prices from other countries, whether it's Canada or somebody else. We're not going to let that happen.
Yet despite being one of the world's most powerful food producers, Canada allowed the United States to sit between its farms and global markets. Grain moved through American rail corridors. Fertilizer crossed U.S. ports. Logistics fees flowed south. It wasn't malicious, it was habit, and habits create dependence. That dependence became dangerous the moment Washington reminded Canada who controlled the choke points.
A new U.S. tariff threat, this time focusing on Canadian fertilizer.
A lot of it does come in from Canada, and so we'll end up putting very severe tariffs on that if we have to, because that's the way you want to bolster here, and we can do it here.
When tariff threats surfaced, grain penalties, fertilizer fees, and vague warnings about market access, Canadian farmers saw the reality clearly. Their livelihoods were exposed to political leverage they didn't control. So Ottawa did something unexpected. Instead of negotiating harder, it redesigned the board. Canada looked north, and what it saw was infrastructure it already owned, but never used. Canada is not a marginal agricultural player. It is a cornerstone of global food security. It controls over 40% of global potash exports. It ranks among the top wheat exporters worldwide. Its grain feeds over 80 countries annually. Yet most of that power moved through systems it didn't command. Western grain typically funnels into Vancouver, a port operating beyond capacity, vulnerable to congestion, strikes, and climate disruption. What doesn't go west often goes south, entering American-controlled supply chains before reaching Europe or Asia. Every step added cost. Every transfer added exposure. For decades, there was no realistic alternative, until the map changed. At the center of Canada's recalculation is a port many had written off as a relic. The Port of Churchill, sitting on Hudson Bay, was once envisioned as Canada's direct agricultural gateway to Europe. Built nearly a century ago, rail-connected and deep-water capable, it offered one simple advantage: distance. Shipping from the prairies to Europe through Churchill cuts thousands of kilometers compared to routing through Vancouver or U.S. terminals. Time, fuel, and fees all drop. But ambition without investment goes nowhere. For decades, Churchill suffered neglect, seasonal operation, minimal upgrades. By the late 1990s, it was effectively abandoned, sold off, underfunded, and nearly forgotten. When flooding damaged the rail line in 2017, the private operator walked away. Churchill went silent, until Indigenous ownership changed the equation. In 2018, a consortium of First Nations communities and northern towns reclaimed the port and rail system. At the time, critics called it symbolic, well-intentioned, economically unrealistic. They were wrong. Because geopolitics has a way of resurrecting neglected assets, the turning point came not from Ottawa, but from industry. In early 2025, a Saskatchewan-based fertilizer producer announced something that barely registered in U.S. headlines. It planned to import key inputs and export finished fertilizer through Churchill, bypassing American infrastructure entirely. No U.S. ports, no U.S. rail fees, no U.S. leverage. The economics were simple. Producing fertilizer in Western Canada and shipping it north reduced transit time to Europe, lowered costs, and insulated the supply chain from American political risk. This wasn't nationalism, it was arithmetic. Once the math worked for one company, the signal went out to the rest of the sector. Fertilizer was only the beginning. Grain is the real prize. Canada moves nearly 30 million tons of grain annually through Vancouver alone. Churchill doesn't need to replace that volume to be transformative. It only needs to capture the flows that make more sense going north. Even shifting 15 to 20% of exports, especially those bound for Europe, would reroute billions of dollars annually. And unlike Vancouver, Churchill offers something no American port can: total Canadian control. Canadian grain, Canadian rail, Canadian port, foreign buyers, no middlemen. That's the shift Washington underestimated. And it's why the $780 billion figure matters. That number doesn't represent all of Canadian agriculture. It represents the value of trade flows that could migrate away from American-controlled routes over the next decade. Potash exports, grain shipments, fertilizer inputs and outputs, specialty crops, even future energy and critical mineral corridors. Add it together, and you're not talking about a port revival. You're talking about leverage loss. The United States won't lose every dollar. Some trade will always flow south. Geography still matters. Markets remain intertwined. But American logistics firms that have profited from Canadian dependence for generations are now facing structural competition, not from China, not from Europe, but from Canada itself. Every grain contract signed through Hudson Bay is leverage lost. The United States assumed Canada had nowhere else to go. That assumption is melting. Canada isn't exiting the American market, it's exiting American control. And once agricultural supply chains are redesigned around Canadian infrastructure, that control doesn't come back. The port that was dismissed as obsolete is becoming the corridor that rewrites the balance of power in North American agriculture. Not through confrontation, but through choice. And Washington is watching it happen, with very few moves left to make.